The betting started before the first Marine even missed. $20, says Jackson washes out on the 200-yard line, someone muttered near the equipment shed. Another voice answered with a laugh. I'll take that action. You'll make it past prone supported. The November sun beat down on Camp Pendleton's rifle range, turning the concrete firing line into a griddle that shimmered with heat waves. 17 Marines stood in formation, weapons at their sides, waiting for their names to be called for annual qualification. The failure rate this cycle was running at 43%, and Gunnery Sergeant Vance had made sure everyone knew it during the morning brief. She stood 30 yards back from the firing line, close enough to hear the range commands, but far enough to stay clear of the controlled chaos. Her name was Nora Reeves, though nobody on the range had bothered to ask. The visitor badge clipped to her collar identified her as civilian, which was apparently all the information anyone needed. She'd arrived an hour earlier with the base chaplain, here to observe training as part of some community outreach program nobody seemed particularly enthusiastic about. The Marines had glanced at her once, noted her gender and civilian status, and promptly dismissed her as irrelevant to their morning. Jackson approached the firing line, his movements crisp despite the tension visible in his shoulders. Gunnery Sergeant Vance stood behind him, clipboard in hand, his voice carrying across the range with the particular blend of authority and disappointment that seemed to be his default setting. You know the drill, Jackson. 50 rounds, multiple positions, minimum qualifying score is 35 out of 50. Current pass rate is 57%. He let that statistic hang in the air like a threat. The first shot cracked across the range. Nora watched the target downrange, saw the white paper remain unmarked. Jackson's second attempt struck low and left, nowhere near center mass. By his 10th round, sweat was running down his face in streams that had nothing to do with the heat. Vance's pen scratched across the clipboard with the particular sound of another failure being documented. Jackson returned from the line 15 minutes later, his weapon slung, his face carefully blank. 19 out of 50, Vance announced to nobody in particular. Washout. The Marines waiting there turned exchanged glances, the kind of looks that said they were all thinking about their own upcoming attempts and finding the thoughts unwelcome. Before we continue, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you grew up around shooting ranges or military bases where you're from. It's interesting how these qualification days bring out both the best and the worst in people. Hernandez was called next. She was a compact woman with the build of someone who'd spent her entire adult life in the Corps, all muscle and focused intensity. Nora watched her settle into prone position, saw the textbook form, the controlled breathing, the steady trigger pull. The shots were better than Jackson's, but better wasn't the same as good. 27 out of 50, Vance called out. Fail. His voice carried no satisfaction, just the flat recitation of facts. Third time this cycle, someone muttered from the waiting formation. She's done. Probably shouldn't even be here, another voice added, quiet enough that Vance wouldn't hear, but loud enough that Nora caught it. Not cut out for it. The morning progressed with mechanical inevitability. Morrison qualified with exactly 35, the minimum score, and looked relieved enough to kiss the rifle. Chun washed out at 23. Rodriguez managed 38 and walked away from the line like he'd just survived something. Patterson fired all 50 rounds and somehow only hit paper 17 times, a feat that seemed to require more effort than actually aiming. By 1100 hours, 9 Marines had attempted qualification. 3 had passed. The sun had climbed higher, turning the range into something that felt actively hostile to human presence. Nora had moved to the thin shade offered by the equipment shed, and that's where she was standing when she heard the conversation that would change the trajectory of the entire day. The civilian shouldn't even be watching this, a lance corporal said, his voice carrying in the stillness between firing sequences. It was Williams, she thought, though she hadn't been introduced to any of them. Bad enough we're failing without an audience. His companion glanced toward Nora, then away, as if even looking was more attention than necessary. Probably never even held a rifle. These community outreach people, they show up, check a box, Go home and tell everyone how they support the troops. Nora said nothing, just watched another Marine approach the line. This one was young, maybe 20, with the kind of lean build that came from recently finishing recruit training. His hands shook slightly as he loaded his weapon, a tremor visible even from 30 yards away. The first shot went wide right. The second went wider. By the time Vance called the ceasefire, the target sheet looked like someone had been practicing avoidance rather than accuracy. 14 hits out of 50 attempts. The young Marine walked back to formation with his head down, and Nora saw something in his posture that she recognized. It wasn't lack of capability. It was the weight of expectation, the pressure of watching everyone else fail, the terrible knowledge that your turn was coming, and you were probably going to add your name to the list of washouts. She'd seen that look before, in a different context, a different range, a different lifetime. Her father had taught her to recognize it, the moment when mechanics failed because the mind was getting in the way, when technique collapsed under the weight of anticipated failure, when decent shooters became terrible ones because they'd convinced themselves that terrible was all they could be. Gunnery Sergeant Vance was calling the next name when Nora stepped away from the equipment shed and walked toward the firing line. Not onto it. That would have been a safety violation, but close enough that Vance noticed her approach. He looked up from his clipboard, his expression suggesting he'd forgotten she existed and wasn't particularly pleased to be reminded. "Ma'am, you need to stay in the observation area. This is a hot range." "I understand that, Sergeant," Nora said. Her voice was calm, conversational, the tone of someone asking about the weather rather than about to make a request that would sound insane to everyone present. "I was just wondering something. Mind if I try that rifle?" The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds before someone laughed. It wasn't a polite chuckle or a nervous sound. It was the kind of laughter that came from hearing something so absurd that the only response was amusement. The laugh came from Williams, the Lance Corporal who'd been discussing her incompetence moments earlier, and it spread through the waiting formation like a contagion. Within seconds, half a dozen Marines were grinning, a few shaking their heads, one actually turning away, as if the request was too ridiculous to witness. Gunnery Sergeant Vance didn't laugh. His expression remained professionally neutral, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of what might have been pity mixed with irritation. "Ma'am," he said slowly, as if explaining something to a child who'd asked to drive a car, "this is the Marine Corps annual rifle qualification. These are trained Marines who've been shooting since boot camp." He gestured at the formation behind him, at the men and women who'd spent months or years learning their craft. 9 attempts this morning, 3 passes. The failure rate among trained personnel is 43% this cycle. "I understand," Nora said. "Do you?" Vance's voice remained level, but there was an edge now, the sound of patience wearing thin. "This isn't a carnival game, ma'am. This is a weapon qualification that determines combat readiness. The M16A4 service rifle fires a 5.56 millimeter round at a muzzle velocity of roughly 3,000 feet per second. You understand what that means?" She nodded once, her expression unchanged. "It means," Vance continued, "that if you don't know what you're doing, you're dangerous. To yourself and to everyone on this range." He paused, seemed to consider his next words carefully. "Have you ever fired a rifle before, ma'am?" "Yes." "A rifle like this?" "Similar." Vance glanced at the Marines behind him, then back at Nora. His face was doing complicated mathematics, trying to calculate how to refuse this request without creating some kind of incident that would require paperwork and explanations. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I don't think you understand what you're asking. This course includes prone-supported, prone-unsupported, sitting, kneeling, and standing positions. Ranges from 200 to 500 yards. Moving and stationary targets. Wind conditions. Stress positions. Marines with years of experience are failing this morning. She'll be lucky to hit the berm," someone muttered for the formation. The comment was quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability, but loud enough that everyone heard it. $20 says she doesn't hit paper at all," another voice added. This one belonged to Chun, who'd washed out earlier with 23 hits. His tone carried the particular bitterness of someone who'd failed and was now looking for someone to fail worse. "I'll take that action," Williams said, "but only if we're betting she hits paper. I'm saying she doesn't even figure out which end to point downrange." The laughter came again, and this time even some of the Marines who'd passed their qualification were grinning. The morning had been tense and miserable, full of failures and frustration, and apparently the idea of a civilian woman making a fool of herself was the entertainment they needed. Vance held up one hand, and the formation quieted. His expression suggested he was regretting every decision that had led to this moment. "Ma'am, I need to be clear about something. If I allow this, and that's a significant if, you'll be required to follow every safety protocol exactly as directed. You'll wear hearing protection, eye protection. You'll keep the weapon pointed downrange at all times. You'll respond immediately to all range commands. Any deviation, any safety violation whatsoever, and you'll be removed from the line immediately. Do you understand?" "Yes, Sergeant." He studied her face, looking for something. Doubt, maybe, or second thoughts, or some sign that she was about to back down and save him from having to make this decision. Whatever he was looking for, he apparently didn't find it. Vance exhaled slowly, the sound of a man accepting the inevitable. "Fine, but you're using training ammunition, and I'm stopping this the moment it becomes clear this was a mistake." "It won't be a mistake," Nora said quietly. "We'll see about that." Vance turned to the formation. "Rodriguez, your weapon and gear." Rodriguez stepped forward, his expression somewhere between amused and curious. He'd qualified earlier with 38, a solid score, and now he was being asked to loan his rifle to someone who was about to embarrass herself spectacularly. He handed over the M16A4, then his magazine pouches, then his shooting mat. The whole transaction felt ceremonial somehow, like watching someone hand over equipment they knew would be returned and used. Nora accepted the weapon with familiar efficiency, her hands moving over it with the kind of casual competence that came from muscle memory rather than thought. She checked the chamber automatically, verified the safety, tested the trigger pull with the pressure that came just before the breakpoint. The movements were quick, practiced, unconscious. Several Marines noticed, their expressions shifting slightly, the amusement fading into something more uncertain. "You know the manual of arms," Vance observed. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes, Sergeant." "Where'd you learn that?" "My father taught me." "Your father was a Marine?" Nora smiled slightly, a private expression that suggested memories both painful and precious. "Something like that." Vance made a notation on his clipboard, though what he was noting was anyone's guess. "All right. Standard qualification course. 50 rounds, multiple positions and ranges. Minimum qualifying score is 35 hits. You'll start prone supported at 200 yards. You understand the commands?" "Yes, Sergeant." "Then take your position." Nora walked to the firing line, and the Marines followed her movement with expressions ranging from skeptical anticipation to outright certainty of impending failure. Williams was actually grinning now, already composing the story he'd tell later about the civilian woman who'd thought she could shoot with Marines. Chun had his arms crossed, his posture radiating the satisfaction of knowing he was about to witness someone fail worse than he had. She settled onto the shooting mat, and the concrete beneath it radiated heat like a griddle. The rifle came to her shoulder with the smooth efficiency of repeated practice, and she built her position with careful attention to fundamentals. Stock firmly seated, cheek weld consistent, support hand position for maximum stability, breathing pattern established. The position felt right in a way that transcended conscious thought, the body remembering what the mind might forget. 200 yards, Vance called out. Prone supported. 10 rounds. Shooter ready? Shooter ready, Nora confirmed. The range is hot. Commence firing. She took her breath, released half, found a natural pause between heartbeats, and pressed the trigger. The first shot cracked across the range with the sharp authority that came from proper ammunition and perfect conditions. 200 yards downrange, the white target paper showed a clean hit center mass, exactly where it was supposed to be. The spotter called it immediately. Hit. Center. Lucky, Williams said, his voice carrying just enough volume to be heard. Beginner's luck. Watch the second shot. The second shot followed 3 seconds later, placed with the same mechanical precision as the first. The spotter's voice came again, perhaps a shade less certain now. Hit. Center mass. Nora's breathing pattern remained unchanged, the rhythm of someone who'd learned long ago how to separate herself from distraction. Third shot. Fourth shot. Fifth shot. Each one announced by the spotter with increasing brevity. Hit. 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 By the sixth shot, the casual conversations behind the firing line had stopped. By the eighth shot, the Marines had moved closer, forming a loose semicircle behind Vance's position, their expressions shifting from amused anticipation to something more complicated. 10 rounds, prone supported, Vance called out. 10 hits. He made a notation on his clipboard, the pen scratching across paper with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been. The silence that followed felt weighted, expectant, as if the range itself was holding its breath. She's just getting warmed up for the miss, Chun said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Wait until she has to shoot without support. That's where everyone falls apart. Transition to prone unsupported, Vance commanded. 200 yards. 10 rounds. Nora adjusted her position, removing the support sandbag, building a new stance that relied entirely on bone structure and muscle tension. The position was less forgiving, more dependent on technique and control, the kind of shooting that separated competent marksmen from merely adequate ones. She settled her breathing again, found her natural point of aim, and fired. The first unsupported shot hit center mass. So did the second. By the fifth shot, Rodriguez had moved forward to stand beside Vance, his eyes tracking from Nora's position to the target downrange and back again. His expression suggested he was watching something that didn't quite make sense, like seeing water flow uphill or watching gravity work sideways. She's shooting better than I did, Rodriguez said quietly. His qualification score of 38 had felt respectable an hour ago. Now it was starting to feel inadequate. 10 for 10, Vance announced. 20 total. His voice remained professionally neutral, but something had changed in his posture. The clipboard wasn't just a recording device anymore. It was evidence of something he wasn't quite ready to name. Okay, but prone is the easy part, Williams said. He'd stopped smirking now, his arms crossed over his chest in a posture that might have been defensive. Wait until sitting position. That's where the wind gets you. Nobody shoots clean through sitting. Transition to sitting position, Vance called. 300 yards. 10 rounds. The wind had picked up since morning, coming in gusts from the west that carried the smell of sage and dust. At 300 yards, wind became a factor that required calculation and adjustment, the kind of real-time mathematics that separated recreational shooters from serious ones. Nora shifted to sitting position, building the stance with the same careful attention she'd given the prone work. Legs crossed, elbows braced against knees, weapon canted slightly to compensate for the wind drift she'd been reading for the past 20 minutes. The first shot took slightly longer to break than the previous ones, an extra second of calculation and adjustment. When it fired, the spotter's call came back with something that might have been surprise. Hit. Dead center. How is she compensating for wind? Hernandez had joined the group now, the Marine who'd washed out earlier with 27 hits. She was watching Nora's position with the focused intensity of someone trying to understand a magic trick. Look at her cant angle. She's reading the flags. Not just reading them, Rodriguez said. She's predicting the gusts. Look how she waits for the lull. The 10th sitting shot completed, and Vance made his notation. 10 for 10. 30 total. He looked up from his clipboard, his eyes meeting those of the assembled Marines. The expression on his face suggested he was reassessing something fundamental, recalculating assumptions he'd held with certainty just minutes earlier. She's at 60%, someone said. 30 hits out of 50 possible. That's already better than half the attempts this morning. She hasn't finished yet, Chun said, but the edge had left his voice. He sounded less like someone predicting failure and more like someone hoping for it, which was a meaningfully different thing. Kneeling and standing are the hard positions. That's where the wheels come off. Transition to kneeling position, Vance commanded. 400 yards. 10 rounds. The distance had increased, and with it the difficulty. At 400 yards, a target that seemed person-sized at 200 became a small rectangle of white paper that required precision and confidence. Nora built her kneeling position with the same methodical care, creating a stable platform from inherently unstable geometry. The position felt solid despite its compromises, the result of thousands of repetitions that had trained her body to find stability where none should exist. She fired the first kneeling shot, and the slight delay before the spotter's call seemed to stretch longer than physics would allow. Hit. Upper center. The second shot followed. Hit. Center mass. By the fifth shot, Williams had stopped offering predictions. By the eighth shot, Chun had uncrossed his arms. By the 10th shot, Gunnery Sergeant Vance was staring at his clipboard like it contained information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about rifle qualification. 10 for 10, he announced. 40 total. His voice had gone flat, stripped of inflection, the sound of someone reading facts that didn't align with expectation. One position remaining. Standing position was universally acknowledged as the most difficult. No support, no bone structure advantage, nothing but muscle control and technique to create stability from instability. At 500 yards, the targets were small enough that even minor tremors translated into misses. The qualification standard expected Marines to hit 6 out of 10 from standing. Most considered that optimistic. Final position, Vance said. Standing. 500 yards. 10 rounds. He paused, seemed to consider adding something, then decided against it. Shooter ready? Nora stood, built her stance, and found that place of absolute stillness that existed between heartbeats and thoughts. The rifle settled into her shoulder like it had always belonged there, an extension of intent rather than a separate object. She found her sight picture, made her calculations for distance and wind, and began the final sequence. The first standing shot hit center mass. The second hit just left of center, still well within the scoring zone. The third shot, the fourth, the fifth, each one called by a spotter whose voice had lost all trace of routine and gained something that sounded almost like reverence. She's going to go perfect, Rodriguez said. He wasn't talking to anyone in particular, just stating a fact that was becoming increasingly undeniable. She's going to shoot 50 for 50. Nobody contradicted him. The Marines watched in absolute silence as Nora fired her sixth standing shot, her seventh, her eighth. The wind gusted and fell, the heat shimmered over the range, and the rifle cracked with mechanical regularity. Ninth shot. 10th shot. The final call came from the spotter, and his voice carried across the range with perfect clarity. Hit. Center mass. 50 rounds fired, Vance said slowly. 50 hits recorded. He looked down at his clipboard, then up at Nora, then back at his clipboard as if expecting the numbers to have changed. Perfect score. 100% qualification. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of recalculation and reassessment, of assumptions being dismantled and rebuilt, of certainty giving way to the undeniable evidence of what they'd all just witnessed. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. The Marines stood frozen in their loose semicircle behind the firing line, their expressions caught somewhere between shock and disbelief, as if they'd just watched physics work backwards or seen gravity reverse itself. Nora safed the rifle, cleared the chamber with practiced efficiency, and stood from her firing position. The shooting mat beneath her feet radiated stored heat, and when she stepped off it onto bare concrete, the temperature difference was almost startling. Gunnery Sergeant Vance was the first to find his voice. He cleared his throat once, twice, the sound of a man trying to restart a stalled engine. Ma'am, he said slowly, I need to verify those targets. Protocol requires visual confirmation of all hits before official scoring. Of course, Sergeant, Norris said. Her tone was conversational, easy, as if she'd just completed a routine task, rather than something that 9 Marines had failed at that morning. Vance turned to Williams and Rodriguez. You two with me. We're walking the line and checking every target personally. He glanced back at Nora, his expression complicated in ways he probably couldn't articulate. "Ma'am, if you'd wait here, please. This will take a few minutes." The three men walked downrange, their figures growing smaller against the backdrop of brown hills and white target frames. The remaining Marines stood in uncomfortable silence, and Nora noticed that none of them were looking directly at her anymore. Their gazes slid past her, around her, studying the equipment shed and the distant mountains and the concrete beneath their feet with sudden fascination. Shun broke the silence first. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" The question came out more aggressive than curious, carrying an undertone that suggested he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. "My father taught me," Nora said simply. "Your father was a Marine?" Hernandez asked. She'd moved closer now, her earlier embarrassment at failing apparently overcome by curiosity. "Something like that." "That's not really an answer," Williams called back. He'd stopped halfway to the targets, apparently unable to resist joining the conversation, even from 50 yards away. Nora smiled slightly, but it was the kind of smile that suggested certain stories weren't meant for sharing. He believed in fundamentals. Propestanza, trigger control, brating disciplina. He said if you built the foundation correctly, everything else was just mathematics and repetition. "You make it sound easy," Rodriguez said. "It's not easy, but it's not magic either. It's just doing the same thing correctly 10,000 times until your body remembers how without your brain getting involved." 10,000 times, Chen repeated. The number seemed to settle on him with uncomfortable weight. "How long did that take?" "Years," Nora said. "Started when I was 7. By the time I was 12, I could outshoot most adults at the range. By 15, I was competing nationally." "Nationally?" Hernandez's voice had shifted from aggressive to genuinely interested. "What kind of competitions?" "Precision rifle. Some 3-gun. A few long-range events." She paused, seemed to consider how much to reveal. "I tried out for the Olympic team in 2008. "Tried out," Williams said. He'd returned from his position halfway to the targets. Apparently, deciding the conversation was more interesting than target verification. "That mean you didn't make it?" "That means I came in 4th at trials. Top 3 made the team." Nora's voice remained neutral, but something in her expression suggested old disappointment, the kind that time had softened but never quite erased. "4th place," Rodriguez said quietly. "That's still exceptional." "4th place is first loser," Nora replied. Then she smiled, taking the edge off the statement. "But yeah, it was a good shoot. Just not good enough." Downrange, Vance had reached the 500-yard targets, the furthest position on the course. Even from the firing line, his body language was readable. He stood very still in front of the target frame, his clipboard hanging forgotten at his side, his head tilted slightly as if he was seeing something that required multiple viewing angles to believe. After a long moment, he made a notation, moved to the next target, and repeated the process. "So you're basically a professional shooter," Chin said. The accusation in his voice was clear, as if Nora had somehow cheated by being competent. "I was," Nora corrected. "Past tense. That was a long time ago. Doesn't look that long ago to me. You just shot perfect on a Marine Corps qualification course. How many people have done that?" "Not many," Hernandez said. She was watching Nora with an expression that had transformed from skepticism to something approaching respect. "I've been shooting for 8 years, qualified expert every cycle, and my best score ever was 47 out of 50. Perfect is rare, even among competition shooters." "Your mechanics are textbook," Rodriguez added. "The way you build your positions, your breathing pattern, the way you read wind. That's not recreational shooting. That's someone who's put in serious time." "My father believed that if something was worth doing, it was worth doing correctly," Nora said. "He didn't tolerate sloppy fundamentals. If I showed up to the range with bad habits, we didn't shoot that day. We worked on the basics until they were right again." "Sounds intense," Williams said. He was intense, but he was also right. You can't build advanced skills on a foundation of shortcuts and bad technique. The fundamentals have to be bulletproof, or everything else falls apart under pressure. "Is he still shooting?" Hernandez asked. "No," Nora said quietly. "He passed away 6 years ago. Heart attack on a Sunday morning. He just finished cleaning his rifles." The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones, less uncomfortable and more respectful. Several of the Marines nodded, the small acknowledgement that transcended words. "I'm sorry," Hernandez said. "Thank you." Nora looked out toward the targets, where Vance was still conducting his methodical verification. "He would have enjoyed watching you all shoot this morning." He respected Marines, said they understood discipline in a way most civilians never would. Even the ones who washed out? Chin asked. There was something vulnerable in the question, as if he genuinely wanted to know whether someone could respect effort even when it failed. "Especially them," Nora said. "He told me once that the people who keep trying after they fail are more impressive than the ones who succeed on the first attempt. Success is about capability," he said, "but persistence is about character." Vance was walking back now, Rodriguez and Williams flanking him like an honor guard. His expression was complex, layered with things that were difficult to name. Professional acceptance mixed with personal disbelief, official acknowledgement wrestling with unofficial amazement. He carried the clipboard like it was evidence in a trial, which in a sense it was. He stopped 3 feet from Nora, and the assembled Marines went silent again. "Targets verified," he said formally. "All 50 hits confirmed. Center mass, or better, on 47 rounds. 3 hits in the 9 ring. Still well within qualification parameters." His voice shifted slightly, losing some of its official quality and gaining something more human. "Ma'am, in 22 years of running this range, I have never seen a perfect score. Not from Marines, not from competition shooters who visit, not from instructors with 30 years of experience." He paused, seemed to be choosing his next words carefully. "That was extraordinary shooting." "Thank you, Sergeant. Where did you really learn to shoot like that?" "I told you. My father taught me." "Your father must have been remarkable." "He was," Nora said simply. "He really was." Vance made another notation on his clipboard, then looked up at the waiting Marines. He seemed to come to some decision, his expression shifting into something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "All right, listen up. I don't know what the rest of you were doing during your qualification attempts, but apparently it wasn't this." He gestured at Nora with his clipboard. "This is what proper fundamentals look like. This is what happens when you build your positions correctly and don't let pressure destroy your technique." He turned back to Nora. "Ma'am, I know this is irregular, but would you be willing to stay for a while? I'd like the Marines who haven't qualified yet to watch you shoot through the course again. Maybe see if we can figure out what they're doing wrong." Nora considered the request for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "I can do that, Sergeant. But if you want them to learn something, maybe we should do this differently. Instead of just watching me shoot again, what if we break down each position, talk through the mechanics before I demonstrate them? That way they can see what I'm thinking, not just what I'm doing." Vance's eyebrows rose slightly, and something in his face suggested he was reassessing her yet again. "That will be valuable, ma'am. Very valuable." He turned to the assembled Marines. "All right, anyone who hasn't qualified yet, front and center. Everyone else, you're welcome to stay and watch, but the priority is getting our failures turned into passes." 8 Marines stepped forward, and Nora noticed that several of them looked younger than the others. Fresh from training, probably facing their first real qualification cycle and discovering that the stress of evaluation could destroy technique they'd executed perfectly in practice. She recognized the tension in their shoulders, the way they held themselves like they were bracing for another round of failure and humiliation. "Let's start with prone supported," Nora said. "It's the most stable position, which means it's the best place to establish your fundamentals. But I saw some of you struggling with it this morning, which tells me the foundation isn't as solid as you think it is." She moved to the shooting mat, settled into position with fluid efficiency. "First question, where should your support hand be?" One of the younger Marines, a private whose name tape read Sullivan, spoke up tentatively. "Under the handguard?" "That's what the manual says," Nora agreed. "But the manual gives you a starting point, not the finish line." She adjusted her grip slightly. "Your support hand position affects your natural point of aim. Too far forward, and you're fighting the weapon. Too far back, and you lose stability." She demonstrated both extremes, then returned to the optimal position. You need to find the place where the rifle wants to point at the target without you forcing it. That's your natural point of aim, and it's different for everyone because everyone's body is different. How do you find it? Sullivan asked. Build your position, close your eyes, relax completely. Then open your eyes and see where the rifle is actually pointing. If it's not on target, don't muscle it there. Adjust your body position until the rifle naturally aligns. Once you find that spot, the shooting becomes easier because you're not fighting yourself. She spent 10 minutes on prone supported, breaking down elements that most shooters never thought about consciously. The angle of the support elbow, the pressure of the cheek weld, the way breathing pattern affected point of impact. The Marines listened with an intensity that suggested they were hearing things their instructors had never mentioned, or perhaps had mentioned, but never explained with this level of detail. Okay, let me shoot a string, and you watch for what I just described. Nora loaded 10 rounds, settled into her position, and fired with the same smooth efficiency she'd demonstrated earlier. 10 shots, 10 hits, each one announced by the spotter with mechanical regularity. When she stood, she saw that several Marines were nodding, as if pieces had just clicked into place. Now prone unsupported, Nora continued. This is where I saw most of you falling apart this morning. Anyone want to tell me why unsupported is harder? No sandbag, Chin said. He'd moved closer, apparently having overcome his earlier bitterness enough to be interested in actually learning. You have to create stability with just your body. Exactly, which means your bone structure becomes your support system. Nora demonstrated, building the position with careful attention to detail. Your support elbow goes directly under the rifle, creating a column of bone from ground to weapon. If your elbow is off to the side, you're using muscle tension instead of skeletal support and muscle fatigue. Bones don't. She walked them through the position piece by piece, correcting common errors she'd observed that morning. The tendency to cant the rifle, the failure to load the bipod properly by driving the weapon forward into the shoulder, the mistake of holding tension in the neck and shoulders instead of achieving natural alignment. Then she demonstrated another 10 perfect shots that made the concepts concrete. By the time they moved to sitting position, word had spread across the base. More Marines had arrived, some still in their working uniforms, others in PT gear, drawn by rumors of the civilian woman who'd shot perfect and was now conducting an impromptu marksmanship clinic. Vance noticed the growing crowd, but made no move to disperse it. Instead, he seemed to have accepted that this morning had transformed into something unprecedented, and the smart move was to let it happen. Sitting position is where wind becomes your enemy, Norris said. At 300 yards, you need to read conditions and adjust. How many of you are actually reading the wind flags before you shoot? 3 hands went up out of 8. Nora nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she'd suspected. That's your problem right there. You can build a perfect position, have flawless trigger control, and still miss if you're not compensating for wind. She pointed at the flags downrange, the fabric strips that indicated wind direction and approximate speed. Learn to read these like a language. Full extension means strong wind, heavy compensation needed. Lazy flutter means light wind, minor adjustment. No movement means you have a window. Take your shot quickly before conditions change. She demonstrated sitting position, calling out her wind readings before each shot, explaining her compensation strategy, making visible the invisible calculations that happened between seeing the target and pressing the trigger. The shots landed center mass, and the watching Marines saw not just success, but the methodology that created it. How do you stay so calm? Hernandez asked. When I'm shooting for qualification, I can feel my heart racing, my hands shaking. How do you block that out? You don't block it out, Norris said. You acknowledge it and shoot anyway. Pressure is always there during qualification. The trick isn't eliminating it. It's not letting it control you. She paused, seemed to be reaching for the right words. My father used to say that pressure doesn't change the fundamentals. It just reveals whether you actually trust them. If you've done the work, if you've built solid technique through repetition, then pressure can't take that away from you. It can only show you whether your foundation is real or if you've been faking it. The silence that followed suggested those words had landed with weight. Several Marines exchanged glances, and Nora suspected they were thinking about their own foundations, wondering which parts were solid and which parts had been shortcuts all along. Kneeling and standing positions took another 30 minutes, each one broken down into components small enough to understand and practice. Nora shot demonstration strings after each explanation. The perfect scores now expected rather than surprising, evidence that the methods she was teaching actually worked under pressure. By the time she finished the complete breakdown, it was past 1,300 hours. The sun had climbed to its apex, and the concrete firing line was hot enough to cook on. "All right," Vance said, stepping forward. "Who wants to try again? Fresh qualification attempt, clean slate. Anyone who washes out this time gets the benefit of what they just learned before their next attempt." All 8 Marines raised their hands. Sullivan stepped forward first, his expression a mixture of determination and lingering doubt. "I'll go, Sergeant. If I'm going to fail again, might as well get it over with." "You're not going to fail," Nora said quietly. "You're going to remember what we just talked about. You're going to trust your fundamentals, and you're going to let the technique do the work." She met his eyes, held his gaze. "Your body already knows how to do this. You just need to get your mind out of the way." Sullivan nodded once, moved to the firing line, and began building his prone supported position. Nora watched his movements, saw him implementing the corrections they discussed, finding his natural point of aim before taking his first shot. The rifle cracked, and the spotter's call came back clear. "Hit, center mass." Sullivan fired his remaining 9 shots, and when he stood from the line, his expression suggested he'd just discovered something important about himself. 9 out of 10, Vance announced. He looked at Sullivan, then at Nora, then back at his clipboard. "That's the best you've ever shot in this position, Sullivan." "I stopped fighting the rifle," Sullivan said. Just like she said. Found where it wanted to point naturally and let it happen. One by one, the other Marines took their turns, each one applying the lessons they'd absorbed. Not all of them shot perfect, but all of them shot better than they had that morning. Chun, who'd washed out earlier with 23 hits, finished his second attempt with 13. Hernandez improved from 27 to 42. By the time the last Marine completed their qualification, 6 of the 8 had passed, and the 2 who hadn't were close enough that Vance immediately scheduled them for retry the following morning. The transformation in atmosphere on the range was palpable, almost physical in its weight. What had begun as a morning of failure and frustration had shifted into something else entirely, something that felt less like qualification and more like discovery. The Marines who'd passed their second attempts were standing in small groups, discussing their shots with an enthusiasm that hadn't been present earlier. Those who'd been watching from the sidelines were asking questions about technique, about wind reading, about how to find that natural point of aim Nora had described. Gunnery Sergeant Vance was standing near the equipment shed, his clipboard now filled with notations that told a story of dramatic improvement. He was talking quietly with Rodriguez when a Staff Sergeant Nora hadn't seen before approached the range. The man moved with the particular bearing of someone who'd been in the Corps long enough that authority sat on him naturally, without effort. His name tape read Castellanos, and the shooting badge on his uniform indicated he was a high expert, the top tier of marksmanship qualification. "Vance," Castellanos called out as he approached. "I heard a rumor that sounded too crazy to be true, so I had to come see for myself. Someone told me a civilian woman just shot perfect on our qualification course." "It's not a rumor, Staff Sergeant," Vance replied. He gestured toward Nora with his clipboard. "She went 50 for 50. Clean sweep. I verified the targets personally." Castellanos turned to look at Nora with open skepticism. "No offense, ma'am, but I've been shooting competitively for 15 years, and I've never gone perfect on this course. Best I've ever done is 48 out of 50. He crossed his arms, his posture suggesting he was waiting for someone to admit this was an elaborate joke. "You're telling me she just showed up and shot perfect?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Vance said. "And then she spent the last 2 hours teaching our washouts how to improve their technique. 6 out of 8 just passed on their second attempt." Castellanos processed this information with visible difficulty. His expression cycled through several emotions before settling on professional curiosity. What's your background, ma'am? Where do you train? Olympic trials in 2008. Nora said simply. Precision rifle, long-range competition. My father was my primary instructor. Olympic trials, Castellanos repeated. He seemed to relax slightly, as if this explanation made the impossible merely improbable. That's a different level. Competition shooting at that tier is basically professional marksmanship. It was a long time ago, Nora said. Doesn't look that long ago from where I'm standing, Castellanos replied. He glanced at Vance, then back at Nora. Would you be willing to shoot another string? I'd like to see this for myself. Before Nora could respond, a voice called out from behind them. That makes two of us. Another Marine approached, this one wearing captain's bars and an expression of intense interest. His name tape read Morrison, and his bearing suggested he was someone accustomed to having his requests treated as orders. I'm Captain Morrison, range officer in charge. Gunny Vance called me about 20 minutes ago and told me something remarkable was happening on my range. I'd like to see it firsthand. Nora looked at Vance, who gave a small nod of encouragement. Sir, she said, addressing the captain, I've already shot the course twice today. I'm happy to demonstrate again if you think it would be valuable, but I don't want to take up time that should be used for your Marines to qualify. My Marines can qualify tomorrow, Morrison said. What I'm hearing about doesn't happen every day, or ever really. He gestured toward the firing line. If you're willing, ma'am, I'd appreciate a demonstration. The crowd that had gathered was larger now, perhaps 30 Marines in various states of attention. Some were supposed to be at other duties, but had found reasons to delay. Others had legitimately finished their work for the day and were watching what had become the most interesting thing happening on base. Nora noticed that the skepticism that had characterized the morning crowd was absent now, replaced by anticipation and genuine curiosity. She moved to the firing line, accepted a fresh magazine from Rodriguez, and settled into prone supported position. The movements were automatic now, muscle memory refined by thousands of repetitions over decades. Captain Morrison stood beside Vance, his arms crossed, his expression professionally neutral, but his eyes sharp with focus. The first shot cracked across the range, and the spotter called it. Hit. Center mass. Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. The second shot followed, then the third, each one announced with the same result. By the 10th shot, Morrison's arms had uncrossed, and he was leaning forward slightly, as if proximity would help him understand what he was seeing. Nora transitioned through the positions with fluid efficiency, each stance built correctly, each shot breaking at the right moment. The Marines watching had gone quiet, not with the hostile silence of the morning, but with the reverent quiet of people witnessing expertise. When she finished standing position and the spotter called the 50th hit, Morrison stood motionless for several seconds before speaking. In my 16 years of Marine Corps service, he said slowly, I have never seen anything like that. He turned to Vance. Gunny, your report understated what this was. That wasn't just good shooting. That was virtuoso-level marksmanship. Yes, sir, Vance agreed. Morrison approached Nora directly, his expression having shifted from skepticism to something approaching respect. Ma'am, I need to ask you something, and I want you to know this is a genuine question, not a criticism. Why aren't you wearing a uniform? With shooting like that, you could be training Marines, running advanced marksmanship programs, contributing at a level most people can't touch. Nora was quiet for a moment, and something in her expression suggested the question touched old wounds. I tried to enlist when I was 22, she said finally, right after Olympic trials. I thought if I couldn't compete internationally, maybe I could serve and use these skills in a way that mattered. What happened? Castellanos asked. Medical disqualification. Her voice remained steady, but barely. Congenital heart condition. Asymptomatic, doesn't affect my daily life at all, but it's on the prohibited list for military service. I appealed twice, got denied twice. They said the liability was too high, that I could never deploy to combat zones, that there was no point in training me if I couldn't serve fully. The silence that followed was uncomfortable, heavy with the weight of institutional inflexibility meeting individual capability. Several Marines exchanged glances, and Morrison's expression had shifted to something like sympathy mixed with frustration. "That's a hell of a waste," Morrison said quietly. "The Corps lost someone who could have made a real difference." "Maybe," Norris said, "or maybe this is exactly where I'm supposed to be." She gestured at the Marines around her, at Sullivan and Chun and Hernandez and the others who'd improved under her instruction. "I couldn't serve in uniform, but I just helped 6 Marines qualify who were failing this morning. That feels like contribution." "It is contribution," Vance said firmly. "Significant contribution." Morrison nodded slowly, his mind clearly working through possibilities. "Ma'am, I know this is highly irregular, but would you consider coming back? We run qualification cycles every month, and our pass rate has been problematic for the last year. If you could spend even a few hours per cycle doing what you did today, teaching the fundamentals you clearly understand at a deep level, it would make a measurable difference in our combat readiness." Nora considered the offer, her expression thoughtful. "I need to clear it with the chaplain's office. I'm here through their community outreach program, so they'd have to approve additional visits. I'll handle that coordination personally," Morrison said. He pulled out a business card, handed it to Nora. "My contact information. If you're willing to do this, I'll make it happen through official channels." She accepted the card, studied it briefly, then nodded. "I'm willing, sir. My father always said that if you have knowledge worth sharing, you have an obligation to share it. I'd be honored to help." The Marines around them had been listening to the exchange, and several of them wore expressions suggesting they'd just witnessed something important, though they might not fully understand what it was. Castellanos stepped forward, extended his hand to Nora. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. I came here skeptical, thinking this had to be exaggerated. I was wrong." Nora shook his hand. "No apology needed, Staff Sergeant. Skepticism in the face of extraordinary claims is just good sense. The only way to overcome it is with evidence, and evidence requires demonstration. You certainly demonstrated," Castellanos said. Then he smiled, the expression transforming his face from stern to warm. "I've been teaching marksmanship here for 5 years, and I just learned more in 2 hours than I picked up in the last year. Thank you for that." 3 weeks passed before Nora returned to the range. 3 weeks during which her name had apparently become something of a legend among the Marines at Camp Pendleton. Captain Morrison had made good on his promise, coordinating with the chaplain's office and establishing an official arrangement that allowed her to visit during qualification cycles. When she arrived on a Tuesday morning in early December, the atmosphere was markedly different from her first visit. Gunnery Sergeant Vance was waiting for her at the range entrance, and his greeting was warm in a way that suggested their relationship had fundamentally shifted. "Ms. Reeves, welcome back. We've got 8 Marines scheduled for qualification this morning, and another 12 who've requested permission to observe. Word got around about what happened last time. I heard rumors were spreading," Norris said. She was carrying her own equipment bag now, a detail that Vance noticed with approval. "Some of them probably got exaggerated. Actually, ma'am, the rumors were mostly accurate, maybe even understated." Vance gestured toward the range, where Marines were already assembling. "Sullivan requested permission to delay his deployment workup by 3 days just to be here when you came back. Said you changed how he thinks about shooting." They walked toward the firing line together, and Nora saw familiar faces in the crowd. Sullivan was there, as promised, along with Chun and Hernandez and Rodriguez. But there were also new faces, Marines she hadn't met before, watching her approach with expressions that ranged from curious to hopeful. One of them, a corporal whose name tape read Mitchell, stepped forward as they approached. "Ma'am," Mitchell said, his tone respectful but direct, "I've failed qualification 3 times this year. I'm 1 attempt away from being removed from my billet and reassigned to non-combat duties. I heard what you did last month. I'm hoping you can help me figure out what I'm doing wrong." Nora set down her equipment bag and studied Mitchell's face, seeing the particular strain that came from repeated failure under high stakes. "What position gives you the most trouble, Corporal?" "Standing, ma'am. I can shoot decent from prone and sitting, but when I get to standing position, everything falls apart. My scores dropped from 70% to maybe 30%. It's like I forget everything I know. That's not uncommon, Nora said. Standing position is where mental pressure translates most directly into physical instability. Let me watch you build your stance, and we'll see what's happening. Mitchell moved to the firing line and assumed standing position with a weapon Rodriguez handed him. Nora watched carefully, her eyes tracking his body mechanics, looking for the subtle errors that accumulated into failure. After 30 seconds, she'd identified 3 separate issues. Okay, stop there, Nora said. She approached Mitchell, positioned herself where she could demonstrate without interfering with his shooting lane. First problem. Your weight distribution is uneven. You're leaning back slightly, which means you're fighting yourself for stability. Standing position requires perfect vertical alignment, spine straight, weight balanced evenly between both feet. Mitchell adjusted his stance, and Nora nodded approval. Better. Second problem. Your support elbow is locked out, which creates tension in your shoulder and translates into weapon movement. You want a slight bend in that elbow, just enough to create a shock absorber effect. Like this. She demonstrated with an unloaded weapon, showing the difference between locked and slightly flexed. Mitchell mimicked the position, and his stance immediately looked more stable. Third problem is the biggest one, Nora continued. You're holding your breath. I can see it in your chest and shoulders, the tension that comes from trying to pause respiration for too long. That creates oxygen debt, which triggers muscle tremors, which destroys your stability. You need to shoot during the natural respiratory pause, not by forcing your breath to stop. How do I do that? Mitchell asked. Breathe, normally 3 or 4 times, then exhale about 60% of your air, not all of it. There's a moment, maybe 2 seconds long, where your body naturally pauses before the next inhale. That's your window. Take your shot during that pause, and your body won't fight you. Mitchell practiced the breathing pattern several times, and Nora watched his shoulders relax as he found the rhythm. When he finally fired a live shot, the round hit center mass, and his expression transformed into something like revelation. That felt completely different, he said. No shaking, no fighting the sights. Just smooth. That's what it's supposed to feel like, Nora replied. You've been creating your own instability through tension and poor breathing. Fix those 2 things, and standing position stops being impossible. She spent the next hour working with Mitchell and 3 other Marines who'd specifically requested help with problem areas. Each one had developed bad habits that had calcified over time, small errors that compounded into systematic failure. Nora had a gift for identifying these issues quickly, for seeing past the symptom to the underlying cause, and for explaining corrections in language that made immediate sense. By the time qualification began, Mitchell looked like a different shooter. His first prone string was 9 out of 10, better than he'd ever shot. His sitting position was 8 out of 10, solid and consistent. When he reached standing position, the test that had historically destroyed him, the entire range seemed to hold its breath. He fired 10 shots with the mechanical precision of someone who'd finally understood what they were doing, and when the spotter called 8 hits out of 10, Mitchell actually laughed with relief. 35 total, Vance announced. Qualified. Mitchell, you just passed by the skin of your teeth, but a pass is a pass. He looked at Nora with something like gratitude. That's 4 consecutive qualifications prevented, ma'am. Mitchell keeps his billet and stays with his unit. The morning continued with similar success. Marines who'd been struggling found their footing under Nora's instruction. Those who were already competent became better, learning refinements they hadn't known existed. By noon, the pass rate for the day was running at 87%, nearly double the base average. During a break for lunch, Staff Sergeant Castellanos approached with another Marine in tow, a major whose uniform indicated he was from the base training division. Ma'am, Castellanos said, this is Major Garrett. He's responsible for marksmanship training across the entire base. He's been hearing reports about your work here and wanted to meet you personally. Ms. Reeves, Major Garrett said, extending his hand. I've reviewed the qualification statistics from your first visit and from this morning. The improvement is statistically significant in ways that are difficult to ignore. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I'm here to ask if you'd be willing to expand what you're doing. Not just occasional range visits, but a formal role in our marksmanship program. What kind of role? Nora asked. Consultant and instructor, Garrett replied. We'd bring you in 2 or 3 times per month, have you work with Marines who are struggling, maybe develop some training materials that capture your teaching methodology. It would be a paid position, properly contracted through official channels. We'd also want you to train our instructors, help them understand the diagnostic approach you're using to identify and correct problems. Nora was quiet for a moment, processing the offer. I need to think about it, Major. This started as community outreach, just a chance occurrence. Turning it into something formal and ongoing is a bigger commitment. I understand, Garrett said. Take your time, but I want you to know that what you're doing here matters. We have Marines who are facing the end of their careers because they couldn't qualify. You're giving them tools they didn't have before. That's not trivial, mess. Reeves, that's mission critical. After Garrett left, Vance approached Nora with a small smile. He's right, about matching. Sullivan told me yesterday that he's recommending you for a civilian service award. Said you changed the trajectory of his career and probably saved his life, since qualification is required for deployment, and deployment is what Marines do. That seems like an overstatement, Nora said. It's not, Vance replied. And it's not. You've been in competition shooting. You know what the difference between success and failure looks like at the highest level. You're bringing that expertise here, and it's changing outcomes for people. That's worth recognizing. The afternoon session brought more Marines, including several who'd heard about Nora during their lunch hour and requested permission to observe. She continued teaching with the same patient precision, breaking down complex skills into manageable components, correcting errors with explanations that made sense, demonstrating techniques that prove her methods worked. By the time the sun started its descent toward the western hills, she'd worked with 14 Marines directly and influenced dozens more who'd watched and learned. As the range closed for the day, Sullivan approached with several other Marines who'd been present during her first visit. Ma'am, Sullivan said, his tone formal, but his expression warm, we wanted to thank you properly. You didn't have to come back. You didn't have to spend your time helping people you don't know. But you did, and it made a difference. 2 months into her formal consulting arrangement, Nora had become a permanent fixture at Camp Pendleton's rifle ranges. She arrived twice weekly now, working with Marines across different units, and her reputation had spread beyond the base boundaries. Other installations were requesting information about her methods. Training manuals were being revised to incorporate techniques she'd demonstrated. The pass rate for rifle qualification had climbed from 57% to 81%, a statistical improvement that had caught the attention of people far above Captain Morrison's pay grade. On a cold February morning, Nora arrived at the range to find an unusual amount of activity. Multiple vehicles were parked near the command post, and Marines in dress uniforms were standing in formation near the equipment shed. Gunnery Sergeant Vance met her at the entrance with an expression that mixed pride and nervousness. Ms. Reeves, he said quietly, I need to give you a heads up. Colonel Hendricks is here. He's the base commander, and he's brought some people from division headquarters. They want to observe you working with Marines today. Nora felt a flutter of unease, but kept her expression neutral. Any particular reason why? Your contract comes up for renewal next month, Vance explained. Major Garrett wants to expand your role significantly, make you the lead civilian instructor for the entire Western region. But that kind of position requires approval from higher up the chain. Today is basically your evaluation, though nobody's calling it that officially. So no pressure, Nora said with a slight smile. Just do what you always do, ma'am. Teach like you've been teaching. The results speak for themselves. Colonel Hendricks was a man in his late 50s with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades in the sun and wind. He approached Nora with measured courtesy, his handshake firm, but his eyes assessing. Ms. Reeves, I've been reading reports about your work here for the past 8 weeks. The statistical improvements are impressive, but statistics can be misleading. I want to see firsthand what's creating these results. I understand, sir, Nora replied. I'm happy to demonstrate whatever you'd like to see. I don't want a demonstration, Hendricks said. His tone wasn't hostile, just direct. I want to watch you do normal instruction with Marines who need help. Major Garrett tells me you have a gift for diagnosing shooting problems and correcting them quickly. Show me that process. The first Marine scheduled for the morning was a sergeant named Palmer who'd failed qualification twice and was facing his final attempt. He approached the firing line with visible tension, his movements stiff, his expression suggesting he expected failure, and was simply going through the motions before the inevitable. Nora spent 5 minutes talking with him before he touched a weapon, asking about his previous attempts, what positions gave him trouble, what he felt was happening when shots went wrong. I tense up, Palmer admitted. I know I do it, but I can't seem to stop. The harder I try to hold steady, the more I shake. That's because you're fighting biology, Nora said. Muscle tension creates tremors. You can't force stability. You have to create conditions where stability happens naturally. She had him assume standing position without a weapon, just building the stance. Now, tense every muscle in your body. Make yourself as rigid as possible. Palmer complied, his entire frame going rigid with effort. Nora watched for 5 seconds, then spoke again. Notice how you're shaking slightly even without the weapon? That's what tension does. Now relax completely. Let everything go soft. Palmer exhaled and released the tension, and his body settled into a more natural alignment. The small tremors disappeared. Nora nodded approval. That's the state you want. Not rigid, not tense, but aligned and relaxed. Your skeleton holds the position, not your muscles. Muscles aim and make fine adjustments, but they don't provide structure. Structure comes from bones. She walked Palmer through a series of exercises designed to help him recognize the difference between structural support and muscular tension. Colonel Hendricks watched from 15 yards away, his expression unreadable, occasionally making notes on a small pad he carried. After 20 minutes of work, Palmer fired his first qualification string and hit 8 out of 10 from prone supported, the best opening he'd ever achieved. Better, Nora said, but you tense up on shots 4 and 6. I saw your shoulders rise slightly right before you pressed the trigger. Remember, relaxed but aligned. Let the position do the work. Palmer continued through the course, and while he didn't shoot perfectly, his improvement from previous attempts was dramatic. He finished with a score of 37, 2 points above the minimum, and his expression when Vance announced the number suggested he'd just accomplished something he believed impossible. Hendricks approached as Palmer was clearing his weapon. Sergeant Palmer, the colonel said, you failed this qualification twice before today. What was different this time? Ma'am taught me things my instructors never mentioned, Sir, Palmer replied. The difference between using muscles and using bones, how to recognize when I'm creating my own instability. It sounds simple when you say it out loud, but it changed everything. Hendricks nodded slowly, then turned to Nora. That was instructive, Ms. Reeves. I'd like to see you work with another Marine. Someone who's already competent but wants to improve. The next shooter was a corporal named Davis who'd qualified expert on his last 3 attempts, but wanted to push his scores higher. He was technically proficient, his positions were textbook correct, but his scores plateaued around 44 out of 50. Nora watched him shoot 1 string, then asked him to pause. You're doing everything right mechanically, Nora said. Your positions are solid, your breathing is controlled, your trigger press is smooth. But you're shooting like you're following a checklist, not like you're reading the environment. You're not adapting to conditions, you're just executing technique. What do you mean? Davis asked. Watch the wind flags between shots, Nora instructed. Really watch them. See how the conditions change every 15 to 20 seconds? You're not accounting for that. You're using the same hold and aim point regardless of what the wind is doing. That's why you're consistent, but not exceptional. Consistency is about technique, but excellence is about adaptation. She spent 30 minutes teaching Davis how to read micro changes in wind conditions, how to adjust his hold and aim point in real time, how to recognize when conditions were optimal for taking a shot quickly versus when patience was required. When he shot his next string, his score jumped to 48 out of 50, and the 2 misses were close enough that minor timing differences would have made them hits. Hendricks was taking more notes now, and the officers with him were exchanging quiet comments. After Davis finished, the colonel approached Nora again. "Ms. Reeves, I've seen enough. Can we speak privately for a moment?" They walked away from the firing line to a quiet area near the command post. Hendricks studied Nora's face for a moment before speaking. "I'm going to be direct with you. Major Garrett wants to offer you a significantly expanded role. Regional lead instructor, responsibility for developing training curriculum, authority to train our current instructors on your diagnostic methods. It's a substantial position with substantial compensation. But it's also going to put you in front of a lot of Marines, some of whom are going to resist taking instruction from a civilian, especially a female civilian in a predominantly male field. Are you prepared for that?" Nora met his gaze steadily. "Sir, I've been competing in shooting sports since I was 7 years old. I've spent my entire life proving capability to people who assumed I couldn't because of my gender. I'm accustomed to resistance. What matters is results, and I can deliver those consistently." "I believe you can," Hendricks said. "What I watched this morning wasn't just good instruction. It was diagnostic expertise at a level most of our professional instructors don't possess. You identified Palmer's problem in minutes and gave him tools that worked immediately. You took Davis from competent to exceptional in half an hour. That's not luck, Ms. Reeves. That's deep understanding of the skill being taught. My father used to say that teaching reveals whether you actually understand something," Nora replied. "If you can break down a complex skill into components that make sense to someone else, then you truly know it. If you can't, you're just mimicking without comprehension. Your father sounds like he was a remarkable teacher. He was, and he would have loved seeing what we're building here. Using knowledge to help people succeed at something difficult, that was what he valued most." Hendricks was quiet for a moment, seeming to reach a decision. "The expanded position is yours if you want it. We'll handle all the administrative details, get you proper credentials, integrate you fully into the training command structure. You'll have authority to modify curriculum, require instructors to learn new methods, push changes through the system. That's real influence, Ms. Reeves. Real ability to shape how we prepare Marines for combat." Nora considered the offer carefully, weighing the commitment against the impact. "I want it, sir. I want to do this at the scale where it makes the most difference." "Then it's done," Hendricks said. He extended his hand, and Nora shook it firmly. "Welcome to the team, Ms. Reeves." Officially this time, the instructor training program began in March, and Nora quickly discovered that teaching Marines to shoot was fundamentally different from teaching instructors to teach. The 12 men assembled in the classroom at Camp Pendleton Training Center were all experienced shooters, most of them qualifying expert consistently, and several of them had been running rifle ranges for years. They were also, with varying degrees of subtlety, skeptical about learning new methods from someone who'd never worn the uniform. The resistance was most apparent in a gunnery sergeant named Briggs, a 20-year veteran who ran the qualification program at Camp Lejeune. He sat in the back row with his arms crossed, his expression suggesting he was enduring a requirement rather than embracing an opportunity. When Nora began her introduction, explaining her background and the diagnostic approach she developed, Briggs raised his hand. "Ma'am, with all respect, I've been teaching Marines to shoot for 15 years. I've put thousands of shooters through qualification. What makes you think your methods are better than what's already working?" The question was aggressive, but Nora had anticipated it. She kept her tone neutral, professional. "Sergeant Briggs, what's your current pass rate at Lejeune?" "Averaging around 62%, Briggs replied. "And how many of your failures are repeat washouts? Marines who failed multiple times?" "Maybe 40% of failures are second or third attempts." Nora nodded. "At Camp Pendleton, before we implemented these diagnostic methods, the pass rate was 57%, and repeat failures were running about 45%. Current pass rate is 81%, and repeat failures have dropped to 18%. Those aren't minor improvements, Sergeant. Those are Marines staying with their units instead of facing reassignment. That's combat readiness increasing measurably." The room had gone quiet, the other instructors watching the exchange with interest. Briggs's expression hadn't changed, but something in his posture suggested he was listening more carefully now. "So you're saying our traditional methods are inadequate," Briggs said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm saying traditional methods are foundational but incomplete," Nora replied. "They teach mechanical execution, which is essential. But they often don't teach shooters how to diagnose their own problems or how to adapt to individual physical differences. Every shooter's body is slightly different, which means their optimal positions are slightly different. Traditional instruction treats everyone identically, which works for some people and fails others. Diagnostic instruction identifies individual issues and provides individual solutions." She spent the next hour demonstrating what she meant, bringing in Marines who'd been struggling and working with them while the instructors watched. The first was a lance corporal who'd failed standing position repeatedly. Nora had him build his stance, then spent 3 minutes asking questions about what he felt, where tension was accumulating, what his sight picture looked like at different moments in his breathing cycle. Within 10 minutes, she'd identified that his dominant eye and dominant hand weren't on the same side, creating a cross-dominance issue that traditional instruction hadn't addressed. "You're right-handed, but left-eye dominant," Nora explained to the lance corporal. "Standard instruction assumes dominance matches, so you've been fighting your own neurology. We need to adjust your stance to accommodate the cross-dominance, or train you to shoot left-hand despite being right-hand dominant." She worked with him for 20 minutes, and when he shot his next standing string, he hit 7 out of 10 compared to his previous average of 3 out of 10. The improvement was immediate and dramatic, and several of the instructors were leaning forward now, their skepticism giving way to curiosity. "How did you diagnose that so quickly?" one instructor asked. His name was Staff Sergeant Morrison, and unlike Briggs, his question sounded genuinely interested rather than challenging. "Questions and observation," Nora replied. "I asked what he was experiencing, watched how his body naturally wanted to align, noticed the slight head tilt he was using to bring his dominant eye to the sights. Once you know what to look for, cross-dominance is fairly obvious. But if you're not asking the right questions or watching for those specific indicators, it's invisible." She brought in 3 more Marines with different issues. One had a flinch reflex that was triggered by anticipating recoil, something Nora addressed through trigger control exercises and bow and dummy drills. Another had incorrectly learned to hold her breath for too long, creating oxygen debt that triggered tremors. The third was simply building inconsistent positions, setting up slightly differently each time, which meant his natural point of aim wandered unpredictably. Each demonstration followed the same pattern. Nora asked questions, observed carefully, identified the specific issue, provided a targeted correction, and produced immediate improvement. By the lunch break, even Briggs had uncrossed his arms and was taking notes. The afternoon session focused on teaching the instructors to conduct similar diagnoses themselves. Nora paired them up, had them work with each other using the questioning and observation techniques she'd demonstrated. The room filled with conversations about shooting mechanics at a depth most of them had never explored. Morrison was asking his partner about tension patterns. Another instructor was discussing the difference between forced breath, holding, and natural respiratory pause. Briggs, working with a younger sergeant, was actually smiling as they discovered an issue neither had previously recognized. By the end of the first day, the atmosphere had transformed completely. The instructors were engaged, asking questions that suggested they were thinking about their craft differently, discussing how to implement these methods with their own Marines. When Nora dismissed them for the day, several stayed behind to ask follow-up questions, and Briggs was among them. "Ma'am," Briggs said, his tone markedly different from that morning, "I owe you an apology. I came in here thinking this was going to be a waste of time, another civilian telling us how to do our jobs. I was wrong. What you showed us today, that's going to change how I run my range." "I appreciate that, Sergeant," Nora replied, "and I understand the skepticism. I'd be skeptical too if someone without military experience was telling me how to do something I've been doing for years. The only way to overcome that is through results. The results speak pretty clearly," Briggs said. "That lance corporal with cross-dominance, I've worked with him twice and never identified the issue. You had it diagnosed in 10 minutes. That's expertise I don't have, and I'm professional enough to recognize that. Over the following 3 days, Nora took the instructors through comprehensive training on diagnostic methods, common shooting problems and their solutions, and how to structure instruction that adapted to individual needs rather than treating everyone identically. She had them practice diagnosing issues with volunteers, correcting each other's assessments, refining their observation skills until they could spot subtle problems quickly. The final day included a practical examination. Each instructor had to work with a struggling Marine, diagnose their specific issues, provide corrections, and produce measurable improvement. All 12 instructors passed, and several of them achieved results that surprised even themselves. Morrison helped a Marine who'd failed 4 times qualify with a score of 39. Briggs identified a breathing problem that had been plaguing a corporal for months and corrected it in 15 minutes. When the training concluded, Major Garrett attended the graduation, such as it was. He addressed the assembled instructors with visible satisfaction. "Gentlemen, what you've learned this week is going to ripple through the entire Marine Corps rifle training program. Each of you will take these methods back to your installations, train your fellow instructors, implement changes that will improve qualification rates across the force. This isn't minor. This is significant advancement in how we prepare Marines for combat." After the ceremony, as the instructors were preparing to depart, Briggs approached Nora one final time. "Ma'am," he said, extending his hand, "thank you for your patience with my attitude that first day. You changed how I think about teaching, and I suspect you're going to change how a lot of Marines shoot. That's a hell of a contribution." Nora shook his hand firmly. "Sergeant Briggs, your willingness to set aside skepticism and actually learn something new is exactly the kind of professionalism that makes this work. Thank you for being open to it." After the instructors departed, Major Garrett approached with Colonel Hendricks. They both wore expressions that suggested satisfaction, mixed with something else, perhaps anticipation. "Ms. Reeves," Hendricks said, "the instructor training was even more successful than we'd hoped. Which brings me to our next request. We want you to develop a comprehensive training manual, something that captures your diagnostic methods in writing, so they can be disseminated throughout the Corps. We also want to schedule regional training sessions, bringing in instructors from installations across the Western region for the same training you just conducted." Nora felt the weight of what he was describing, the scale of influence they were offering. "That's a significant expansion, sir." "It is," Hendricks agreed, "but the results justify it. We're not asking you to do more of the same, Ms. Reeves. We're asking you to help us fundamentally improve how the Marine Corps trains marksmanship. That's the opportunity here, if you're willing to take it." 6 months into her expanded role, Nora found herself standing in front of 47 Marine instructors from installations across California, Arizona, and Nevada. The Regional Training Center at 29 Palms was larger than Camp Pendleton's facility, and the assembled instructors represented hundreds of thousands of Marines who would eventually be touched by the methods being taught today. The weight of that influence was not lost on her. Among the assembled instructors were faces she recognized from previous sessions, including Gunnery Sergeant Briggs, who'd become something of an advocate for her methods at Lejeune. But there were also new faces, including several senior officers whose presence suggested this training had caught attention at levels far beyond what Nora had initially imagined. A colonel named Patterson sat in the front row, his uniform indicating he was from Marine Corps Training Command at Quantico. His presence felt significant in ways Nora didn't fully understand yet. She began the session the way she always did, with a simple question. "How many of you have worked with Marines who failed qualification multiple times despite appearing to have adequate mechanical skills?" Every hand in the room went up. "How many of you felt like you were missing something, like there was a diagnosis you couldn't quite identify?" Most hands stayed up. "That's what we're going to address over the next 4 days," Norris said. "Not just how to teach shooting mechanics, but how to identify the specific issues preventing individual Marines from succeeding. Because mechanical instruction only works if the Marine can actually implement what you're teaching, and implementation requires understanding what's blocking them first." She spent the morning on assessment techniques, teaching the instructors how to observe subtle indicators of problems. The way a shooter's shoulders rose slightly when anticipating recoil, revealing a flinch reflex. The head tilt that suggested cross-dominance. The irregular breathing pattern that indicated improper respiratory control. These were details that separated adequate instruction from truly diagnostic teaching. During the lunch break, Colonel Patterson approached with Major Garrett. "Ms. Reeves," Patterson said, his tone formal but not unfriendly, "I've been reviewing the statistical data from installations that have implemented your methods. The improvements are consistent enough that they can't be attributed to chance or selection bias. Camp Pendleton, Lejeune, Miramar, all showing significant increases in pass rates and decreases in repeat failures. That's statistically remarkable." "Thank you, sir," Nora replied. "The methods work because they address individual issues rather than treating all failure as identical." "I'm aware," Patterson said, "which is why I'm here personally rather than sending a subordinate. Training Command wants to standardize these diagnostic methods across all Marine rifle training. That means incorporating your work into official doctrine, updating field manuals, requiring all instructors to complete certification in these techniques." He paused, studying her face. "It also means we'd want you to come to Quantico for 6 months, help us develop the curriculum, and train the master instructors who will then cascade this throughout the Corps." Nora felt the magnitude of what he was describing settle on her like weight. "That would be a significant commitment, sir. I need to consider whether I can relocate for that length of time." "I understand," Patterson said. "Take the time you need. But I want you to understand the scope of what we're discussing. This isn't regional anymore, Ms. Reeves. This is Marine Corps-wide implementation. Your methods would become the standard for how we train every Marine to shoot. That's profound influence." After lunch, Nora demonstrated advanced diagnostic techniques with volunteers from the local base. One was a sergeant who'd been instructing for 7 years, but had hit a plateau in his own shooting. Nora worked with him for 30 minutes, identifying that he developed a subtle anticipation habit, tensing microseconds before the shot broke, which created inconsistency he couldn't consciously detect. The correction was simple once identified, and his next string of fire showed immediate improvement. Another volunteer was a corporal who'd failed qualification 6 times and was facing administrative separation from the Corps. She was visibly nervous, her hands shaking before she even touched the rifle, and Nora recognized that the mechanical issues were secondary to the psychological weight of repeated failure. "Corporal Jenkins," Nora said gently, "how many people have told you that you're going to fail again?" Jenkins looked startled by the question. "A lot, ma'am. My platoon sergeant said I should just accept it. Some of the other Marines started calling me washout." "That stops today," Nora said firmly. "You're not a washout. You're someone who hasn't received the right instruction yet. There's a difference." She spent 10 minutes just talking, helping Jenkins separate her identity from her qualification struggles, reframing failure as diagnostic information rather than personal inadequacy. Then they worked on mechanics, and Nora identified that Jenkins had been trying so hard to control her breathing that she was creating oxygen debt and tunnel vision. "You're not breathing enough, not breathing too much," Nora explained. "Your body needs oxygen to function smoothly. Breathe normally, shoot during the natural pause, don't force anything. Your body knows what to do if you stop fighting it." Jenkins shot her first string with Nora coaching and hit 8 out of 10. Her expression transformed from resignation to something like hope. She shot again, this time without coaching, and hit 7 out of 10. The assembled instructors watched in silence as someone they'd been told was hopeless demonstrated that the label had been wrong all along. "That's what I'm talking about," Nora said, addressing the instructors while Jenkins stood beside her with tears forming in her eyes. "Jenkins doesn't have a shooting problem. She has a diagnosis problem. Everyone assumed she couldn't shoot, so nobody looked deeper to find out what was actually wrong. Once you identify the real issue, correction becomes possible." Briggs stood up from his seat. "Ma'am, permission to speak?" "Of course, Sergeant. I had a Marine like Jenkins last year," Briggs said. "Failed 5 times. I recommended him for reassignment. Watching this now, I realize I failed him, not the other way around. I treated his failure as inevitable instead of as a problem to solve. That's on me, not on him. It's on all of us, another instructor added. His name was Captain Ryan, and he ran training at Camp Pendleton. We've been teaching mechanics and expecting that to be sufficient, but mechanics alone don't address individual barriers. This diagnostic approach, it's what we should have been doing all along. The afternoon session focused on psychological factors in shooting performance. Nora taught the instructors how to recognize when pressure was destroying technique, how to help Marines separate performance anxiety from actual skill deficits, how to rebuild confidence in shooters who'd internalized failure. These were elements that traditional instruction rarely addressed, treating them as character issues rather than training issues. By the third day, the instructors were conducting diagnoses themselves, working with volunteers, and applying the methods they'd learned. The success rate was high, and more importantly, the instructors were asking increasingly sophisticated questions, demonstrating that they were thinking about shooting instruction at a deeper level than before. On the final day, Colonel Patterson observed the practical examinations where each instructor demonstrated their diagnostic abilities. He watched them identify cross-dominance, correct flinch reflexes, adjust positions for individual body mechanics, and address psychological barriers. When the examinations concluded, he stood to address the group. What you've learned this week represents the most significant advancement in Marine marksmanship training in the last 2 decades, Patterson said. Each of you will return to your installations and implement these methods. Within 6 months, every Marine instructor in the Western region will be certified in diagnostic techniques. Within a year, this will be standard across the entire Corps. His gaze moved to Nora, and that transformation is happening because one woman asked a simple question on a rifle range 8 months ago. Mind if I try that rifle? He paused, letting that sink in. Sometimes the most important contributions come from unexpected sources. Ms. Reeves has never worn our uniform, but she's made a contribution to our combat readiness that most Marines never achieve. That deserves recognition. After the session concluded, as instructors were departing, several approached Nora individually to thank her. Jenkins, the corporal who'd been facing separation, was among them. "Ma'am," Jenkins said quietly, "I don't know how to thank you properly. You didn't just teach me to shoot better, you made me believe I could succeed at this. That's worth more than the qualification." "You did the work, Corporal," Nora replied. "I just helped you see what was blocking you. The capability was always there." That evening, Major Garrett found Nora alone in the training center, reviewing notes for the manual she was developing. He sat down across from her with a thoughtful expression. "You know what you built here, right? This isn't just improved training methodology. This is cultural change. You've taught Marines to see failure differently, to treat it as a diagnostic opportunity rather than a character flaw. That changes how we develop people, not just how we teach them to shoot." "I hope so," Nora said. "My father used to say that how you respond to someone's failure reveals more about your character than theirs. If your first response is judgment rather than curiosity, you've failed as a teacher. Your father would be proud of what you've accomplished here," Garrett said. Nora was quiet for a moment, emotion tightening her throat. "I hope so. I really hope so." The invitation to Quantico arrived in April, delivered formally through official channels with a deployment date set for June. 6 months embedded at Marine Corps Training Command, working with the master instructors who would carry her diagnostic methods to every rifle range in the Corps. It was the culmination of everything that had begun with a simple question on a November morning, and Nora accepted without hesitation. Before she left California, Major Garrett arranged a final session at Camp Pendleton, a gathering he described as celebratory but which felt more like a reckoning. The Marines assembled in the training center auditorium represented every stage of Nora's journey. Sullivan was there, the young Marine who'd been present at her first perfect score. Chun and Hernandez, who'd failed that morning and learned to succeed under her instruction. Mitchell, who'd been one attempt away from losing his billet. Palmer, who'd conquered his tension problems. Jenkins, who'd overcome the washout label and was now qualified expert. But there were also dozens of faces Nora didn't recognize Marines she'd never met, but who'd been taught by instructors she'd trained, second and third-order effects of methods that had spread through the teaching chain. The auditorium held perhaps 200 people, and the combined weight of their attention was almost overwhelming. Gunnery Sergeant Vance opened the proceedings with characteristic directness. 8 months ago, a civilian woman asked if she could try the rifle. It seemed like a crazy request from someone who had no business on a military range. He paused, and a ripple of knowing laughter moved through the room. Best decision I ever made was saying yes. Ms. Reeves didn't just shoot perfect that day. She showed us that we'd been teaching shooting wrong for years, and she gave us better tools. Captain Morrison spoke next, presenting statistical analysis that made the improvement undeniable. Pass rates up 24% across installations using diagnostic methods. Repeat failures down 63%. Average qualification scores increased by 9 points. Time to qualification reduced by an average of 2 attempts. These aren't minor improvements, Morrison said. These are Marines staying with their units, deploying when they're supposed to deploy, maintaining combat readiness that directly affects mission capability. Then Colonel Hendricks took the podium, and the room went completely silent. Ms. Reeves, Hendricks said, addressing Nora directly, "When I first observed you working with Marines, I was skeptical. A civilian without military experience teaching Marine skills we'd been teaching ourselves for decades. It seemed improbable, but I learned something important that day. Expertise doesn't require a uniform. Contribution doesn't require a service record. What matters is whether you can make Marines more effective at their mission, and you've done that better than most people who've worn this uniform their entire careers." He held up a leather folder that Nora hadn't noticed before. "The Commandant of the Marine Corps has authorized me to present you with the Superior Public Service Award, the highest recognition we can give to a civilian. This is for exceptional contribution to Marine Corps mission readiness and for advancing the combat effectiveness of Marines through innovative training methodology." He opened the folder, revealing a certificate and a medal, both official and formal in their presentation. "Ms. Reeves, on behalf of the United States Marine Corps, thank you for your service." The room erupted in applause, 200 Marines standing simultaneously, and Nora felt emotion crash over her in a wave she hadn't anticipated. She accepted the award with hands that wanted to shake, and when she stepped to the podium, she had to pause for several seconds before she could speak. "I need to tell you something," Nora began, her voice not quite steady. "When I was 22, I tried to enlist. I wanted to serve, wanted to be part of something that mattered. I was rejected for medical reasons, and I thought that was the end of my opportunity to contribute to something larger than myself." She paused, emotion tightening her throat. "My father told me that service takes many forms, and contribution isn't limited to wearing a uniform. He said if I had knowledge worth sharing, I had an obligation to share it, regardless of whether I could serve officially." She looked out at the assembled faces, seeing a tension that felt almost sacred in its intensity. "You gave me the chance to do that. You let me contribute in the only way I could, and you treated that contribution with respect. That's a gift I can never adequately repay." Sullivan stood up from his seat in the third row. "Ma'am, permission to speak?" "Of course," Nora said. "You said we gave you a chance," Sullivan said, his voice carrying across the quiet room. "But from where I'm standing, you gave us something more valuable. You gave us tools we didn't have, understanding we were missing, and belief that we could succeed when we'd been told we couldn't." He gestured at the Marines around him. "Half the people in this room failed qualification at least once before you taught us better methods. Some of us, like Corporal Jenkins, were facing the end of our careers. You didn't just improve our shooting, ma'am. You changed our trajectories. That's not a small thing." Jenkins stood as well, her voice clear and strong. 8 months ago, I'd given up. Everyone told me I was a washout, that I didn't have what it took. You spent 30 minutes with me and identified what 5 instructors had missed. You made me believe I could succeed, and then you gave me the tools to actually do it." She paused, emotion visible in her expression. "I'm deploying to Okinawa next month as a qualified expert. That's happening because you saw potential where everyone else saw failure. One by one, Other Marines stood, each adding their voice to what was becoming a chorus of transformation. Chun talked about going from 3 failures to consistent expert qualification. Hernandez described how the breathing techniques had changed her entire approach to shooting. Mitchell explained how staying with his unit because of qualification had led to a promotion he'd thought was impossible. Palmer detailed teaching his Marines the diagnostic methods he'd learned, perpetuating the change. Gunnery Sergeant Briggs was the last to stand, and his voice carried the weight of professional acknowledgement. "Ma'am, when I met you 6 months ago, I was skeptical. I thought I knew everything about teaching marksmanship, because I've been doing it for 15 years. You showed me I've been doing it adequately, but not excellently, and you taught me the difference. I went back to Lejeune and implemented your methods. Our pass rate went from 62% to 79% in 3 months. That's hundreds of Marines who would have failed under the old system who are now qualified and ready." He paused, his expression serious. "You didn't just contribute to the Marine Corps, ma'am. You fundamentally improved how we train. That's legacy-level impact." Major Garrett stepped forward with a final presentation. "Ms. Reeves, when you go to Quantico next month, you'll be training the instructors who train every Marine rifle coach in the Corps. That means your methods will eventually touch every Marine who qualifies with a rifle. Hundreds of thousands of people over the coming years." He held up a bound document. "This is the draft training manual you've been developing, now approved for official publication as Marine Corps doctrinal material. Your name will be on the cover, and your methods will be the standard. That's permanent influence." The session concluded with individual Marines approaching to thank Nora personally, to share stories of success that had seemed impossible months earlier, to express gratitude that transcended the formal award presentation. Sullivan handed her a photograph of his entire platoon, all of them qualified expert, with a note on the back that read, "Thank you for teaching us we could." Jenkins gave her a shooting patch from her deployment unit, already worn and valued. Chen presented a challenge coin he'd received for marksmanship excellence, passing it forward as a symbol of techniques perpetuated. As the auditorium emptied, Vance approached Nora with a quiet smile. "You know what you did here, right? This started with you asking to try a rifle, and it became a movement. You changed how we think about failure, how we develop Marines, how we measure success." "That's extraordinary, ma'am. It started with my father teaching me that contribution matters more than recognition," Nora replied. "And with Marines like you being willing to say yes when someone asks for a chance." She looked around the empty auditorium at the space where 200 voices had just affirmed transformation. "This wasn't just me, Gunny. This was all of us choosing to believe that better methods were possible." "Maybe," Vance said, "but you're the one who showed us what better looked like. That's leadership, ma'am, uniform or not." Quantico in June was humid and green, fundamentally different from the desert landscapes of California where Nora had spent the previous 8 months. The Marine Corps training facility sprawled across thousands of acres, and the rifle ranges where she would spend the next 6 months were state-of-the-art, equipped with technology that made Camp Pendleton's facilities seem almost quaint by comparison. But the fundamentals remained the same: Marines, rifles, targets, and the eternal challenge of teaching people to consistently hit what they aimed at. Colonel Patterson met her on the first morning, walking her through the facility and introducing her to the master instructors she would be training. These were the most experienced marksmanship teachers in the Corps, men and women who'd spent decades perfecting their craft and who would now carry her diagnostic methods to every installation, every unit, every rifle range where Marines learned to shoot. The weight of that responsibility was enormous, but Nora had learned to carry weight over the past months. The training began the same way it always did, with a question. How many of you believe you're already teaching marksmanship at the highest possible level? Most hands went up. How many of you have Marines who fail repeatedly despite your best instruction? Every hand stayed up. That contradiction, Nora said, is what we're going to resolve. You're good instructors teaching good mechanics, but mechanics alone don't address individual barriers. We're going to add diagnostic capability to your existing expertise. Over 6 intense weeks, Nora worked with 32 master instructors, teaching them not just methods but methodology, not just techniques but thinking patterns. She taught them to observe what shooters did unconsciously, to ask questions that revealed hidden issues, to separate symptoms from causes. The instructors were professional and skilled, and they absorbed the training with the focus of people who recognized genuine expertise when they encountered it. By the end of July, the first cohort of trained instructors was deploying back to their installations, carrying curriculum materials, training protocols, and diagnostic frameworks that would reshape how Marines learned to shoot. Nora began working with the second cohort immediately, and then the third, each group representing dozens of installations and hundreds of subordinate instructors who would eventually learn these methods. In August, Nora received word that the training manual she developed was being printed and distributed corps-wide, official doctrinal material that would guide rifle instruction for years to come. In September, statistical reports began arriving from installations where the newly trained instructors had implemented diagnostic methods. The results were consistent with what she'd seen at Camp Pendleton. Pass rates climbing, repeat failures dropping, average scores increasing. The methods worked at scale, which meant they would persist beyond her personal involvement. In October, Colonel Patterson called her to his office for a conversation that felt weighty before it began. "Ms. Reeves," Patterson said, settling into his chair with the bearing of someone about to deliver important news, "your contract here concludes at the end of November. We need to discuss what happens next." "I assumed I'd return to California," Nora replied. "Continue working with the Western Region installations." "That's one option," Patterson said, "but it's not the only one, and frankly, it's not the best use of your capabilities." He leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. "The Commandant's office has been tracking the results of this diagnostic training implementation. The improvements are significant enough that they want to expand your role substantially. We're prepared to offer you a permanent position as the Marine Corps Senior Civilian Marksmanship Advisor, based here at Quantico, with authority over all rifle training doctrine and curriculum development." Nora felt the magnitude of the offer settle over her. "That's extraordinary, sir, and humbling. It's also appropriate," Patterson replied. "You've earned this through results, Ms. Reeves. You've changed how we train, improved our combat readiness measurably, and created methodology that will outlast both of us. That deserves formal recognition and permanent authority." He paused, studying her face. "The question is whether you want it." Nora was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the journey that had brought her here. A November morning asking to try a rifle. Marines who'd been willing to say yes. Transformation that had cascaded from individual instruction to systemic change. Her father's voice in her memory, telling her that contribution took many forms and that service wasn't limited to uniforms. "I want it," Nora said finally. "I want to do this work at the highest level, where it makes the most lasting difference." "Then it's settled," Patterson said, extending his hand across the desk. "Welcome to the permanent team, Ms. Reeves. You've earned your place here." The final months at Quantico passed with the intensity of important work done well. Nora trained the remaining cohorts of master instructors, refined training materials based on field feedback, and began developing advanced diagnostic methods for special operations units whose shooting requirements exceeded standard qualification. She worked with weapons developers to design training aids that would help instructors identify common problems more quickly. She consulted with medical personnel about physical limitations that affected shooting performance and how to accommodate them. In November, 1 year after that first morning at Camp Pendleton, Nora received a letter forwarded through official channels. The return address was unfamiliar, but when she opened it, she recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from Sullivan, now deployed overseas, writing to tell her that his unit had just completed qualification using the diagnostic method she developed. Every Marine in his platoon had qualified expert, something that had never happened before in the unit's history. His letter ended with a simple sentence that carried weight beyond its words. "You changed my life, ma'am. I wanted you to know that." More letters followed over subsequent weeks. Chun writing from Okinawa about teaching younger Marines using techniques he'd learned from her. Hernandez describing how she'd been selected as her unit's marksmanship instructor because of her improved performance. Mitchell reporting a promotion that had seemed impossible a year earlier. Jenkins sending a photograph of herself on deployment, rifle in hand, wearing the expert badge that had once seemed unattainable. Briggs forwarding qualification statistics from Lejeune showing sustained improvement months after implementation. If you enjoyed this story, please drop a comment and let us know your favorite part, character, or if you've ever witnessed someone prove doubters wrong in spectacular fashion. These stories of unexpected expertise and earned respect remind us that contribution comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most important question is simply asking for a chance to show what you can do. On a cold December morning, exactly 13 months after she'd first asked to try that rifle, Nora stood on a Quantico rifle range watching a new class of instructors work with struggling Marines. She saw diagnostic techniques being applied correctly, individual issues being identified and addressed, Marines who'd been failing now succeeding under proper instruction. The methods had taken root, grown beyond her personal involvement, become systematic and sustainable. Major Garrett had traveled from California for meetings at Quantico, and he found Nora during a break in the training. Watching your work spread like this, he said, gesturing at the range where transformation was happening in real time, it's remarkable. You've built something that will outlast both of us, something that will help Marines for decades. My father used to say that the best teaching makes itself unnecessary, Nora replied. You teach people to diagnose their own problems, and eventually they don't need you anymore. That's what we've built here. These instructors don't need me to tell them what to do. They can figure it out themselves using the frameworks we've developed. That's legacy, Garrett said quietly. Real, lasting legacy. Nora thought about that word, about legacy and contribution and service that took unexpected forms. She thought about her father, who'd taught her that knowledge shared was knowledge multiplied, that helping one person succeed was worthwhile, but teaching them to help others was transformative. She thought about Sullivan and Jenkins and Mitchell and all the Marines whose trajectories had changed because someone had been willing to diagnose their problems instead of accepting their failures. She thought about that November morning, standing 30 yards from a firing line, watching Marines fail, hearing dismissive comments, making a decision to ask a simple question. Mind if I try that rifle? For words that had opened a door she hadn't known existed, that had led to transformation neither she nor anyone else had anticipated. The rifle range at Quantico stretched before her, Marines learning from instructors who'd learned from her, methods perpetuating and spreading, becoming doctrine and practice and culture. Somewhere out there, on ranges she'd never visit, instructors she'd never meet were teaching Marines using diagnostic frameworks she'd developed. Thousands of shooters improving because someone had asked the right questions, looked beyond the obvious symptoms, treated failure as diagnostic information rather than final judgment. Colonel Patterson appeared beside her, his expression thoughtful as he watched the training unfold. You know what impresses me most about this, he said after a moment. It's not just that you taught us better methods. It's that you taught us to think differently about failure and potential. That's deeper than technique, Ms. Reeves. That's cultural change. My father would have loved seeing this, Norris said softly. He believed that everyone had potential, and that failure usually meant we hadn't found the right approach yet. He said the mark of a good teacher wasn't producing success. It was refusing to accept failure as inevitable. He was right, Patterson said, and you've proven it at scale. He gestured at the range, at the Marines being taught by instructors who'd absorbed that philosophy. This is his legacy too, in a way. The understanding he gave you, you've given to us. Nora nodded slowly, emotion tightening her throat. She pulled out her phone, scrolled to a photograph she kept there always. Her father at a rifle range, decades younger, teaching a 7-year-old girl to build a proper prone position. The image was faded but clear, capturing a moment that had set everything in motion. He'd be proud of what you've built, Patterson said, seeing the photograph. I hope so, Nora replied. She looked out at the range one more time, seeing not just the training happening now, but the future it represented, the countless Marines who would benefit from methods she developed, the lives and careers that would be different because someone had been willing to ask a simple question and someone else had been willing to say yes. The winter sun was setting over Quantico, painting the rifle range in shades of gold and amber. Marines were securing weapons. Instructors were conducting after-action reviews. Another day of transformation was concluding. Nora stood in that moment between what had been and what would come, understanding that she'd found her form of service, her way to contribute, her legacy built not from wearing uniform, but from sharing knowledge that made those who did wear uniforms more effective at their mission. "Mind if I try that rifle?" she'd asked 13 months ago. The answer had been yes, and that yes had changed everything. Not just for her, but for thousands of Marines who would shoot better, qualify more consistently, stay with their units, and deploy ready because someone had taught their instructors to diagnose rather than judge, to analyze rather than accept, to believe in potential rather than resign themselves to failure. That was service Nora understood now. Real service, lasting service, the kind her father had told her took many forms and wasn't limited to uniforms or titles or official recognition. Service was using what you knew to help others succeed, teaching them not just skills but thinking, building systems that persisted and spread and made the world incrementally better. The range was empty now, quiet except for the wind moving through the trees surrounding the facility. Nora gathered her equipment and walked toward the training center, carrying the weight and privilege of work that mattered, contribution that would outlast her, legacy built one diagnosed problem and one corrected technique at a time. Her father had been right all along. Service took many forms, and sometimes the most important thing you could do was simply ask for a chance to show what you could contribute, then deliver results that made the asking worthwhile.